Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to Research Funding 101. So I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which most of us meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. I extend this acknowledgement and respect to the Dharawal speaking people, whose lands on which I have the pleasure of living and working on. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within this university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So thank you all for joining us. For those of you I haven't yet met, my name is Kirsten Jackson and I am the Program Manager at the Sydney Environment Institute. The Sydney Environment Institute is one of the university's multidisciplinary institutes, and our aim is to bring together expertise and researchers from across all of the faculties for a just and sustainable environmental transition in which all life can flourish. So the workshop today, we will be providing you all with an introduction to research funding. We'll touch on the four main categories of research funding that the uni is expecting, some of the key schemes that you all might come across and want to apply for, and then we'll give you some tips and tricks along the way that will help on your research pathway. This workshop is part of the Sydney Environment Institute's funding and pitching series, which will include some more specific topic workshops, which we will share links to later, and some one-on-one research support given by the SEI team. Please feel free to join the Sydney Environment Institute if you have a personal or a professional interest in environmental research, and you can always reach out to me if you've got any questions or want to know how to engage with us as an institute. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's two speakers. We have David and Thom with us. David Schlosberg is Professor of Environmental Politics in the Department of Government and International Relationships in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He is also Director of the Sydney Environment Institute. David's work focuses on contemporary environmental and environmental justice movements, environment and everyday life, and climate adaptation planning and policy. We also have Thom who is Associate Professor in the School of Humanities, also in Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and he is our Deputy Director of Member Engagement here at the Sydney Environment Institute. Thom's research focuses on some of the philosophical, ethical, cultural, and political issues that arise in the context of species extinction and human entanglements with threatened species and places. Thom is also a current member of the ARC College of Experts. So importantly to today's session, both Thom and David have incredible track records of securing research funding, as well as experience with a variety of schemes and funding bodies. Before I hand over to David, if you have any questions along the way, you can pop these in the Q&A box just on the bottom or side of your screen. And we'll also have a Q&A session a little bit later so you can unmute and ask questions then as well. So David, over to you.
This is really meant for folks who are just new to the funding landscape in Australia, what's available, and the different types of grants. Most folks will certainly focus on what they know about the ARC, and Thom will talk about that in depth in a bit. ARC funding is what most of us know, that kind of sort of state-based research work. That's what most of us were taught to look for in humanities and social sciences. It's really sort of the major area of funding. Though lately, obviously, it's become a lot more competitive, a lot more difficult. Australia now has the honor of having one of the lowest investments in that kind of research of developed nations. So working on that, but that's the idea of category one. It's that sort of classic research for academics. The ARC represents, like I said, Thom will talk more in depth about that. There is a push at the University of Sydney for the university to do better here in a number of areas, including on climate change research. We just don't do as well as a number of the other universities here. So it'll be nice to see the kind of assistance that the university gives generally, though, of course, SEI and Thom in particular give us help there. But that's not the only place that we can look for funds, right? SEI has run a number of projects for local government, for state government, and for federal government. This is the Cat 2 area, category 2 area of schemes. Can range from very informal interactions with folks at the local level to a range of projects, and I'll talk about those. But this really is a bit of looking for schemes, and it's a bit of relationship development as well. This is really impact-driven research for governments. Cat 3, we'll talk about category 3, which is the sort of work that's done in the development office, helping link people and their projects to potential philanthropists. There's a whole art to that that some of us are better at than others. And there's also in this Cat 3 funding area is the sort of private foundations. And some of that is invite only, so you have to be known to them. Some of it is research that you can actually apply for. But that's that sort of private realm of category 3. And Cat 4 is the CRCs, Collaborative Research Centers, that Kirsten will talk about, which are really interesting and I think a growing opportunity for us in the multidisciplinary space. So obviously I looked through who was applying to come to this. A lot of the work that we do is based in the social sciences and humanities, or is social science and humanities in concert with others. It's a bit more, I was going to say it's a bit more difficult, but I think the success rates are as bad across the board. Thom can talk about that, but it is a challenge, I think, for some of our young humanities and social science scholars to articulate their work in a way that goes over in Cat 2, 3, and 4. But that's one of the things that we are here to assist with. So let's just go ahead and talk more in depth about each of those categories. And I'll pass over to Thom to focus first on that Cat 1 scheme.
Thanks, David. And thanks everyone for coming along, and to Kirsten and Evie for the organisation. So yeah, I'm going to talk briefly about Category 1. It's the area of funding that I have the most familiarity with. It's where I've gotten sort of almost all of the funding that I've had for research has been either from Category 1 from the ARC, or from Category 1 like schemes in other countries. So funded by governments primarily, or big philanthropic organizations in other countries. And so technically it falls under Category 3 as international funding, but it has a lot of the same, that international funding that we'll talk a little bit more about under Category 3. Works in similar ways to a lot of our Category 1 funding, in that it's really focused at sort of basic research, if you like. It doesn't have to have as strong a case for its applied industry or policy outputs. So for that reason, as David's already said, it's often the sort of go-to for humanities and social sciences in Australia. So the ARC being the biggest one, although, or the biggest one for HAS disciplines, although there are others listed on the slide there. So I'll focus on the ARC, and there really are these three main families of funding that are on the slide there. Under the Discovery Program family includes some of the fellowship schemes that you've probably heard of, like the DECRA and the Future Fellowship and the Laureate Fellowship. And then there's the Discovery projects themselves. And then under the linkage scheme is a similar kind of project-based funding. But in this case, it has to be a linkage with an industry, with a partner. It could be industry, government, NGO, and cultural institution. It could be any kind of partner you're working with in the linkage scheme, but they need to be making a financial contribution alongside that made by the ARC and the university. And then the industry fellowship schemes are quite new and mirror those other fellowship schemes that I just mentioned under the Discovery Program, like the DECRA, the Future Fellowship, and the Laureate. And those are schemes that are pitched at different career stages: early career, mid-career, and later career. But so across those funding schemes, we're really talking about, with the fellowship schemes, the provision of a salary for 3 or 4 years usually, and then on top of that, with the fellowship schemes, some sort of basic project costs. And then with the discovery projects and the linkage project, it's all about those project costs. And really, there's a few things to think about when you're deciding whether it's a linkage or a discovery project. In particular, how significant might other partners, external partners, be? But there are a lot of things to also think about when you're deciding whether the ARC is the right funder. And one of those is the kinds of outputs you have in mind, the kind of research you want to do, but also the scale of the research. So with discovery projects, for example, you have to ask for a minimum of $150,000. So over 3 years. So that's something to think about. If your project's just not that big, then the discovery project is not right for you. And really the maximum is in theory very high for a discovery project, but in reality, the funding rarely exceeds $500,000 or $600,000 over 3 or 4 years. So again, if that's not going to be enough money for you, then that's probably not the right scheme either. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but I guess I'd just say that there's schemes for individual researchers, for teams, working with industry or other partners, or working independently. So there's a broad range there, but the success rate, as David mentioned, is quite low. It's usually around 15 to 20% on most of those ARC schemes, although sometimes sort of significantly lower. But it is one of the main areas that SEI researchers get their funding from. And just to name two recent examples, there's Sophie Chow has a wonderful DECRA project at the moment, looking at human-kangaroo relationships across a whole range of different areas, and the sustainability, but also the cultural issues involved in how those relationships shake out with kangaroos. And then another recent project from Susan Park, actually got 2 discovery projects recently as part of team. I think at least one of them as part of a team on a project that investigates grievance mechanisms and how they relate to possibilities for eco-justice and to unequal exposures to environmental risk. So they're very varied projects, but I guess one of the key things for the ARC is they're often quite conceptual projects that are really trying to make research innovations, as well as potentially contributing significant sort of applied outputs. But the applied outputs are not the core focus, I guess, of a lot of the ARC schemes, although they are increasingly being asked for in some form or another. So you do have to think about, how is this research helpful to the country, to the community, to a community, to the environment, maybe. But you can really, at its core, still be doing a project where the primary goal is to make an innovation in research. And that with category 1, I mean. Okay, I'll leave it there.
One of the things I was going to say also about Cat 1, and maybe we can have a discussion about this later, is for very early career researchers, it's quite difficult to get a discovery project if you don't have some kind of previous track record. And so one of the things that we encourage folks to do is to join up with others, to be a junior CI, or to be a CI with someone more senior who has more of a track record, and that can improve your chances. And what SEI is here to do is to help you make those kinds of links, to bring those kinds of teams together. The same with the linkage projects. We can certainly assist in developing the relationship with external agencies or cultural bodies or others. So there is that assistance here to develop the kind of relationships that can improve the Cat 1 applications. So the other thing that we have gotten quite good at in the last few years at SEI is this Cat 2 set of schemes. And this is research money that comes out of local government. A number of the local government areas will have various kinds of schemes of different sizes. Comes out of state government, comes out of federal government. So there's quite a bit of work that we have done at all of these levels, and we're always having conversations, especially after budget day, of where money is, where it's available, what questions there might be. So examples here of work that we've done. we've done work with the City of Sydney. The City of Sydney has this great knowledge exchange grant program. Anything that is applicable at the local level, you can propose to the City of Sydney, and there's some support there. What we did with that is we proposed a knowledge exchange grant. We got 120,000 over 3 years, and then we used that as matching funds for a linkage grant. So we were able to connect the Cat 2 with the Cat 1 and did fairly well on that. There are some examples of some fairly large schemes and teams that come together. So one of the first things we did was to work with folks in public health for a research hub on the social and health impacts of climate change. And that was a $500,000 grant to the university to fund then a series of other projects that people would apply to. So that was a nice package of money through Cat 2, which we were then able to distribute internally. But that assisted the state, and there, for each one of those projects, there was someone from state government, from ADAPT New South Wales, who worked with researchers to develop the project and then to try and incorporate the work on the other end. And then most recently, we're in the midst of doing work funded by the federal bushfire recovery project. We've got some money from what was Resilience New South Wales, their disaster risk reduction fund. So all of these types of programs, you just need to be fairly vigilant about paying attention to what is open, what's available. SEI is developing a grant calendar to keep track of the more obvious ones, but sometimes things just come up fairly quickly with a fairly quick turnaround. This is one of the main differences between Cat 1 and Cat 2. You don't have the luxury of a 3 or a 4 year or a 5 year program. Oftentimes working with local, state, and federal government, it's fairly short term. It's a year, it's 18 months, it's 2 years to get the outputs ready. On the plus side, one of the nice things about working with Cat 2 is you'll often actually get what you ask for. So you can actually propose something, include research assistant or a PhD or a postdoc, and actually get the funding you need to do the project, as opposed to a lot of Cat 1 work where you might have your project approved, but with a budget that's 30% less than what you asked for, and then you're scrambling to figure out how to do it. And so it's really nice in the Cat 2 area to do this kind of contract research, to do this kind of commissioned research, competitive research with governments in particular. So again, this is something that SEI can help with. It's something that we've really dedicated ourselves to over the last couple of years. It's something where, in particular, we've helped to develop employment pathways for PhD students into postdocs, hiring recent PhDs to project manage these grants. It's a way for early career researchers to develop project management skills as well. So there's a variety of benefits of working in this Cat 2 area. And again, this is something that SEI is working on, where we can assist, where we can help folks to find partners to develop budgets and project schemes and all of that. So again, any questions in this space, we're happy to talk about it after. But why don't we move on to Cat 3? And I guess I can talk a little bit about this, but Thom, why don't you start and talk about some of the international schemes?
So there are a lot of great international schemes out there. The ones that I've focused on, as I said a moment ago, are more sort of like our Category 1 schemes, but coming from other governments. There's a lot of reasons, I think, to go looking for that money overseas, especially if you're a humanities and social sciences researcher. To begin with, the funding's often a lot more generous. The success rates are often a lot higher. And there's often just sort of more of it, depending on the countries you're looking at. But if you look to Europe, for example, I think there's just more of a general culture of interest in the humanities and arts. And there's just a lot more money floating around for that kind of work, often overseas. So there is a page that I think we'll provide a link to on the university intranet later that includes a list of a whole range of international schemes that you might think about. There are a lot of other schemes, though, that aren't listed on that page, unfortunately. So the best thing to do is to talk to colleagues, talk to people in your area, if you're in history or English, or about those kinds of international schemes that might exist precisely in your area, or sort of the general humanities or social sciences schemes. Just to name a few that we've had success with at SEI, or that other researchers in the same sort of area that I've worked with in the past that other institutions have had success with. They're things like the European Research Council, the Leverhulme Foundation in the UK, the Marie Curie Fellowships, which are a European research community scheme, a bit like the DECRA, aimed at early career researchers. The Volkswagen and Templeton Foundations, are two great schemes in Germany and the US, respectively, that often offer generous funding. And the Humboldt Foundation is another really great one that I've had a fellowship from, and various other folks at SEI have had funding from. And those are 6 to 24-month fellowships based at any institution in Germany. They're very generously funded. They'll pay for your partner to come over as well, and kids. They'll give you additional funding to do German lessons if you want to do German lessons, but you don't have to speak German or learn German. And the success rate for that scheme, the Humboldt, for example, has been 30%. So almost double that of the DECRA and future fellowship schemes. So yeah, if you are open to going to Germany, or have colleagues in Germany, or can even talk to a senior colleague about their contacts in Germany, or talk to SEI, where we have partners at German institutions, and just find a good place to be based, then that's an option. Of course, there are limitations and drawbacks. One of them for most of this international funding is you have to be mobile enough to go overseas. It's not always the case, but most of the time they want you to at least spend some time that they're funding overseas. And you have to almost always be working with, even if you're doing independent research, you have to be based somewhere or have collaborators in the country that's providing the research. Again, not always, but a lot of the time. And so if you don't have those networks, you need to talk to others about how to build them. And then the other big hurdle that, again, we hope to be able to help with is that the funding landscape is just quite different in a lot of other countries. So if it's really helpful to have somebody who's had funding from that organization before to look at your application, or at least to talk to somebody who's really familiar with the funding landscape. So, for example, to learn that the kind of thing that we put forward to the Australian Research Council just won't fly with the European Research Council. They really want big, high risk, high reward projects that would just scare the ARC. But that's sort of a requirement for European Research Council funding through their main Horizon schemes. So you really need to know enough about the funding landscape to know what's going to fly.
That's great. Thanks, Thom. On that one point about, if you are mobile, there are quite a few schemes. Yeah, the Humboldt is one, but certainly in the UK, Thom mentioned Leverhulme. The British Academy also does the same sort of thing. But a number of institutions have residential fellowships like this, not always as generous as Humboldt, and not amenable to partners, for example, like what Rachel Carson Center is doing now, where it's great. It's funded research, and you get to go and hang out on a farm outside of Munich, but all the rooms are single, and they don't want partners involved, right? So it's 6 months by yourself doing work. So there are a number of those, and again, we have relationships with folks who have either gotten that kind of funding or are in country, and that's the kind of networking that we do. This is also another reason why it's helpful for folks to come along to some of those sort of external partner meetings that we'll often do with external engagement, because you can develop partnerships with folks at university partners, Copenhagen, Utrecht, most recently met with Glasgow and Toronto, to get a sense of what kind of funding is available in those countries and what kinds of partnerships would lead to that. But the other thing I wanted to get to in this category 3 space is the sort of private foundation funding and philanthropic funding. The private foundation funding is quite a difficult nut to crack, but again, this is where partnerships and teams come in. There are a number of schemes that open and that we, members of SCI, have applied to, both domestic and international. And again, put those to a grant and can assist each of those. And one of the tricky things about some of the private foundations is that they won't always tell you exactly what it's for with one funder. But it's always worth the try. One of the things that Thom hasn't mentioned about these kinds of grant schemes, both the domestic, the CAT one, and this is you can always do something. You're developing a project. You can always do something with a clearly articulated project. You can send that to a number of funders. You can develop it in a number of ways. And that's the last point I want to make. The other folks helping us in this category is the University Development Office. And we're finding more and more potential funders, private funders in Australia, who are interested in climate and sustainability and sort of multidisciplinary approaches to environment. And we just need to let the development office know what folks are doing. We need to have very clear sort of project descriptions. This is something that we're working on. So if you're developing something, if you think it's something that a philanthropist might be interested in, come and talk to us, come and talk to Kirsten. We can develop some kind of project pitch that we can share with our friends in development. So that's the major set of things I've got for CAT 3. And next, Kirsten, you want to talk about CRCs?
So this is probably the smallest or most bespoke funding category. As an early to mid-career researcher, it's exceptionally hard to lead a bid for a CRC, but you can always tap into project and education funding. So the Cooperative Research Centre's grants are a federal program. They run out of the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. So this scheme provides for medium to long-term industry-led research and development collaborations. And I will note quickly that by industry in government terms, we're talking about anyone who is not a university. So there's 2 streams of funding within the CRC program. There are cooperative research centres, and then there are CRC projects. So the cooperative research centres are 5 to 10-year research collaborations that received matched federal funding to work on areas of national priority. There's currently 24 that are active, and they range between the smallest one, which is the Smartcrete CRC. It has about $40 million funding in total, up to the Developing Northern Australia CRC, who are sitting on about $150 million of funding. Bids to become a CRC can be submitted annually, though there's maybe 1 to 3 approved every year. And bids are a lot of work, and you almost certainly won't get up the first try. The CRCs that Sydney University is already a partner to are the ones that are listed here on the screens. So these CRCs all will have 3 broad deliverables. They have to deliver a research strategy. So they'll usually have 4 or 5 pillars based around themes within their areas. And then within each of those pillars, they will run research projects. These projects are always industry pushed or industry problems. But because of the way CRCs run, universities get really good return on investments. So if you can get up a project through a CRC, you're looking at a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 return on your investment for any research project. CRCs also have to deliver education. So they will all have PhD scholarships and top-up programs, possibly for masters as well. And oftentimes they will have an element of capability and development for industry. So that might be something like professional development, it could be internships, it could be PhD-based PhD-based, industry-based PhDs, or industry-based learning. The third thing that CRCs all have to deliver is called utilization. Often it's kind of just a synonym for commercialization. So CRCs all need to add something to the economy. This might be new jobs, it could be a new tech or product, or it could be a savings or efficiencies in some way. Some of these are really obvious. So the cochlear implant was a technology that came out of the hearing CRC. Some are less obvious, so they might be things like efficiencies found within a process or a system, or they could be new jobs created for the economy. Most CRCs will aim to generate enough of their own IP or to develop really strong collaborations during their funding to spin out into their own organisation or research institution. So the bushfire CRC and then the bushfire and natural hazards CRC, which wrapped up in 2021, had a huge profile. They had really active and engaged partners, and they had the ability to secure additional funding. So that has all led to the creation of what we currently know as Natural Hazards Research Australia. Every CRC runs just a little bit differently. So the easiest thing to do for researchers is probably to look into these CRCs. They'll all have their research themes on the websites and possibly an open round for expressions of interest in PhDs or projects. And they will always list the contact person for Sydney University. So for these ones that we're partnered on, you can look up the website, find out who internally is our lead contact, and you can reach out to them and say, how can I get involved? How can I get up a project? So the other small part that I mentioned of the CRC program is the CRC projects. So Cooperative Research Centre projects, stupidly named, but they are essentially small CRCs. You can apply for $3 million of funding within a 3-year period. And similar to CRCs, you have to have a collaboration between industry and research partners. You have to be aligned with the national research priorities. And the aim is to test a proof of concept or develop a product or a service, or you can deliver an education and training element. So that's a quick recap of CRCs, and David, back to you for a little bit more on funding multidisciplinary research.
So thanks, Kirsten. That's really helpful, and actually a lot of that work is multidisciplinary. Look, SEI is, as described at the beginning, it is one of the multidisciplinary institutes at the university, and our responsibility and our mission really is to bring people together across disciplines to do a variety of different kinds of research. And there are pros and cons to doing that. And I'm thinking, again, you know, this is a sort of funding 101 for early career researchers. There are pros and cons here. The pros are definitely, getting on a grant. If we pull together teams, we're always looking for early career researchers to help folks build not just their publication profile, but their research profile as well. We like to build large teams for projects like that. So I mentioned some money we got from the Disaster Risk Reduction Fund out of New South Wales state government that has at least 10 CIs from across campus looking at the sort of the spontaneous work of local communities after disasters in a variety of different ways. And that's been, it's been a really important project, but it's been really good for folks to get a sense of what multidisciplinary work is like, but also get their names as CIs on a project, which just helps to build that research record. We also often hear from our colleagues in the natural sciences about needing some social science or humanities add-on element to something that they're doing. So most recently, there's a huge grant going forward for a hydrogen research center funded by the NSF and CSIRO that's going forward. And we put a few scholars on that to look at the community impacts, community engagement, labor relationships, labor training, there's a whole number of things that go along with that sort of hydrogen transition, which come out of not just engineering and physics, but can also be assisted by the social sciences and humanities. And again, that's the kind of matchmaking that we try and do. The downside of some of this, and this is really key for us to hear about, if you hear this from your heads of schools or potential employers, we'll often hear that folks should stick to their own discipline, that they should only get X kind of funding for their own disciplinary projects, that they should only publish in their own disciplinary journals. We've been fighting this battle for a decade now, and the main argument against that kind of critique is that this is an opportunity to add on to other work that you're doing, right? So doing that kind of multidisciplinary work, getting a publication in a journal that isn't core to your discipline is in addition to also doing that work that is in a discipline. So in a number of these multidisciplinary projects, we will publish multiple pieces in multiple journals. So we'll publish in a health journal, we'll publish in a geography journal. So there's a range of things that we can do, and everyone is a co-author on a variety of things. So there is a benefit there, but we'd always like to hear about heads of schools and others arguing against the kind of multidisciplinary teams, grants, and outputs that we put together. Thom's going to give some final tips for you, and then we'll open it up to a conversation.
And I think the other thing to bear in mind about multidisciplinarity and about teams is that it's getting increasingly difficult to get funding even from the ARC for sole CI, single discipline projects. They're often just not seen as being innovative enough for whatever reason. So I think even if that's what you would prefer to do, you do have to think carefully about the strategy of that and what's going to make your application most competitive. So I'll just give a few quick thoughts on tips and then wrap it up. But I think the biggest thing is to make sure you're talking to people about applications, about what schemes are available. And then as you're developing a funding application, you're talking to people who have the relevant experience and getting feedback on drafts. There's quite a lot of support, especially for the ARC at the University of Sydney, and for ARC applications. There's less support for things outside the ARC. Because there's often there's not as clear a pipeline and not as clear often a set of expertise with funding from that organisation, or that funding body. So sometimes you've got to seek out who those people are, that they talk to us or talk to people in your own school or faculty to identify those people, because your chances of success with a scheme you're not familiar with without getting that kind of advice are very low. So as part of that, I think a good tip for everyone is to review other people's applications wherever you can, and to provide feedback on them, but also to be an external assessor on applications wherever you can, to get that experience whenever you're asked to do it, because it for me is one of the places I find out about other funding schemes. I'm asked to assess their applications, and I also build a bit of a sense of how those schemes work. The first tip on the slide there about having backup plans is really, you've got to follow the rules of the schemes you're applying for. But if you spend a lot of time developing a grant application, it's a real shame to just put it in somewhere and have it fail and then have wasted that time. So you really want to be thinking about what's your backup plan, where are you going to send it next if this doesn't work? How does a DECRA become a discovery project potentially, or a Humboldt Fellowship application? And also potentially, how might that grant application become a journal article? So how can you get the most out of the time you're investing in trying to find funding? Collaborations are often extremely important depending on the funding scheme, but especially if it's a more applied scheme where they really want you to be developing useful outputs. That's just the nature of the problems we're engaging with, that interdisciplinary collaboration is often at the core of that. Or you need those collaborations to be eligible for a scheme, to have a German partner or whatever it might be. So that's something you've often got to do proactively, or it's most helpful to do proactively, to be thinking about starting up those conversations, whether it's coming along to the kinds of international engagement events David mentioned, or just beginning to talk to other people who might be potential collaborators within and beyond the university in Australia and overseas. I've already covered point 3. Point 4, thinking carefully about engagement and impact for all funding schemes. Be ambitious, but don't overpromise. And most importantly, make a plan to deliver impact. I think that's key for all of these schemes we've been talking about. Even for the ARC these days, you really want to have the kind of the benefit with one of the criteria that your application is assessed on with the ARC. You really want to be ticking that engagement and impact box in some way. Whether that could be developing policy, that could be developing a new technology, but it could also be fostering a greater sense of community understanding and dialogue through an exhibition or podcast or whatever it might be, but really somehow taking it beyond the basic research to have it make a difference in the world is really key. So yeah, I think I'll leave my tips there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Thom. So now we have a bit of time to open it up to anyone's questions. If you have anything about specific schemes that we've talked about or the particular categories, please feel free to put up your hand or you can type it in Q&A. David and Thom, given your experience at the university maybe, and possibly more when you were EMCRs, is there a particular category or type of funding that the university is particularly interested in seeing you get? Do you have, do they definitely want category 1 and don't really care about category 4? Is there any kind of politics maybe to think about when you're searching out funding?
Look, I think the university just wants people, they want to see that people can raise money. And it's not just Sydney. For early career researchers in particular, demonstrating that you can raise money, that some external body trusts you enough to give you money to do work, is absolutely key to have on an application. I mean, even 30 years ago when I started doing this, that was the advice, to have 2 grants of any size from any funder on an application. And so I started doing this kind of work quite early on. But I think for University of Sydney right now, it's interesting because our our DBCR, Emma Johnston, is quite concerned about the low success rate in Cat 1, especially in the ARC. I don't think that's, well, we would say that's not necessarily the fault of the University of Sydney because the success rate is plummeting across the board, but it's still the fact that the University of Sydney does worse than others in the GOA. So there is work being put to improve that. And I think the work that Thom does and a number of others, there really is a lot of assistance in the development of any kind of ARC project. So they certainly want to see that. But look, with the new strategy of the university, one of the things folks want to see is impact. They do want to see that the university is seen as assisting in the solving of problems. So I think the Cat 2 work in particular, working with the city, working with the state, working with federal government, that's a really important thing for the university to see. And it shows that you are someone that does want to reach out beyond the university, have an impact, as the strategy says, impact the grand challenges we face for the public good. That's what a lot of that Cat 2 stuff does for folks.
I guess I've been less steered by what the university would like me to do, as by what I would like to do, and what I have prioritized in my search for research funding has been the kind of research I want to do. So I think you can be a researcher who's very proactive, who looks, what funding schemes are out there, what project could I develop for that scheme, and that's a great way of working. And I know a lot of people who work really successfully like that. I don't work that way. I have projects that I come up with that I really want to do, and then I go looking for the funding body, and I don't really modify them to suit funding bodies. And that's why funding bodies like the ARC have been my friend, because they're the only ones who allow a level of indulgence, really. So I think you can make that decision for yourself, but then you've really got to figure out how to do that well. Likewise, you can decide, do I really just want to work on my own? Again, if you really just want to work on your own, there are fellowship schemes out there. And there perhaps aren't that many of them, unless you're willing to spend a fair bit of time overseas. There are very few in Australia, so you do have to be weighing those things up. But you can make the decision about what kind of research do I really want to do, and then go looking for that funding. And that's what I've done. But it's not a great plan for everyone, and I think there's many different ways of doing it.
For early career researchers in particular, and especially given the landscape in Australia right now and the limited number of jobs here, I think some of the schemes that Thom is talking about abroad, across Europe, in the UK, less so in the US, these are ways not only to get something on your CV, but to really spend some time developing networks. And those are networks that can lead to further grants, can lead to other jobs. If you are interested in and able to leave Australia, it's a really good career development scheme where you can do what you want to do, but also meet other folks outside of this country who are doing that kind of work.
First, just thank you to all three of you, Kirsten, Thom, and David, for sharing and kind of delving into your experiences. I think there are lots of points that resonate, and I have a few questions, but I'll try and sum them up kind of succinctly. Thom, what you last said about kind of devising your own projects and going after them, I think that's a little bit more the category my work tends to be in. As a result of that, I've applied to 2 different ARC grants so far in my time at UCIT and not received either of them. But what I haven't done is something that David talked about earlier, which is joining larger grant applications with multiple CIs. And I wonder, because I've heard this now repeatedly, that once you kind of get your foot in the door at the ARC, it's easier to kind of be flagged and seen as a researcher who is potentially going to be able to fulfill what they're saying they can for a grant. I wonder how to, flag that for yourself within UCIT. So I think I need to kind of move myself in that direction if I want to continue applying for Category 1 funding, and maybe other folks are in that spot. And I don't know that continuing to apply on my own for Category 1 grants is going to be the most successful approach. So maybe I'll kind of just leave it there, because that's a big one.
Yeah, I think that approach you've just suggested, Diana, is the best one to do. I think I've mostly applied for ARCs on my own, but actually the first one I got was with a senior colleague, and that I'm sure was very helpful to me. And I also have heard many times that once you have your foot in the door at the ARC, it is easier. I don't know how whether we have any data to back that up. We've got very little data on anything from the ARC, so it's hard to back much up. But that does seem to be a commonly repeated thing. So there might be something to it. And certainly in the assessment process, around the feasibility criteria, there is often a lot of emphasis, even though it's a relatively minor criteria. There's a lot of emphasis placed on whether the person has the background to really deliver this, especially if it's a sole CI who hasn't had significant funding in the past. So I think being part of a team on an ARC grant is definitely the way to go. How to go about doing that is often a bit more challenging. It can be just about coming up with something that's interesting. In fact, I'm on leading a discovery project at the moment that's like that, where we just came up with something that we thought was an interesting topic, and we just invited 5 other people to join us. That is one way of going, but we also do things at the SEI, like last year, and we'll do it again this year, where we got people just to come along and talk about their current interests and what kinds of broad areas they might like to develop funding applications in, and we try and do a bit of sort of basic matchmaking. There's only so much of that you can do, in a limited amount of time, and these things usually emerge more successfully when they're organically emerging out of conversations on the side of conferences and things. So I guess, I think it's really just a matter of, I think that's a good strategy, trying to do a group ARC, but then just having as many conversations as possible with interesting people is the best way to do that. And a good thing to remember with the ARC too is you can have international PIs. So if you have good colleagues overseas, I think it's often a good idea to have some others in Australia as well, but you can have them on there as actual, like principal investigators from folks from overseas. And that can be really helpful to draw on their networks and their expertise, their reputations.
We've had another here that's an anonymous participant posting regarding the different funding categories, how much is focused on the person rather than the idea. So I suppose maybe if you could touch on outside of category 1 and ARC, is that particularly relevant and important for categories 2, 3, and 4?
It's really difficult to generalize the response to that question. It depends on the scheme. The nice thing about government schemes in Cat 1, including the European, the UK ones, is they're very clear about what they're looking for, right? They're very clear about, and for many of them, including with the ARC, you can look up what the evaluation questions are to the reviewers, right? You can see exactly what it is they're looking for under each category. You can see the percentage under each category. They're very transparent that way, but they're different, right? So some will focus on the person and others will be, what's the originality of the idea, but it really differs and you can't really generalize there. When it comes to the Cat 2 and 3 stuff, it's a mystery. It really, that's all you can say. One of the nice things about working with SEI, because I hear this and I heard it yesterday at a workshop on adaptation that had folks from local, state, and federal government, SEI has a reputation. So working with SEI, having that kind of research environment as part of your application does help, because it's not just you. There is a sense that there is a research environment, right? There is a track record and there's staff there to assist in the grant. So I think coming to us with that and that kind of support system, that kind of research environment is really crucial.
Thom, I might throw this one to you because we have discussed it between ourselves anyway. How do you, or what's your suggestion for someone looking to fund themselves? Let's say you're an early career researcher, fixed term contract that might run out before you get a grant. What are your tips of, getting yourself a position and funding that as a researcher?
There are a variety of funding sources out there that are available to people with and without continuing positions. The reality is that it is often much easier to get funding once you have had other funding and once you have a permanent position and that you have that kind of stability, which is obviously ironic and unfortunate for many people who are trying to get a foot in the door. So I don't think I have any sort of general advice on that. I think if you have the flexibility in your personal life to be able to go overseas, as a very early career researcher who doesn't yet have a continuing position, I would highly recommend that. I just did it because I wanted to, but it's ended up being immensely valuable for me, for the networks, which David mentioned a moment ago, but also just because there is so much funding, much more funding available overseas.
Let me add, and that's a really good question, Anya, and we've been thinking about this at SEI, and one of the things that I'm really sort of proud and relieved about is the Cat 2 stuff that we've been able to pull together to give really good people who've just finished their PhDs, postdocs, to project manage work for us. And we want to do much more of that. When it comes to that Cat 2 work, one of the nice things is if we know you ahead of time and we know you're the right person ahead of time, we can name you as a CI. Right? You don't have to have a continuing position in that Cat 2 space. And so you can be named and then you've got it on your CV. You're a CI. Often with some of the funds that we've raised, we've hired postdocs, we've advertised and hired them after the fact, but you're getting project management experience. And one of the really nice things about that is if we can hire someone full-time on a research gig, that's a pretty good spot to be in because you do have time to do the project that we're assigning to you, but we always give people, and I don't know if this is the case generally, but I certainly as a CI make sure that people have time to work on their own stuff as well, to get some of the publications out from their PhD to really sort of set themselves up. So we are at SEI, we really are trying to work in that direction. I think one of the things that we do need to do to assist people is to get a really good sense from all of our members what their focus areas are, what their interests are, so that when these opportunities come up, because they often come up very quickly, that we know exactly who to go to, right? And that's the kind of database that we're building.
So we are close to finishing, and David can go through a few next steps of ways you can engage with us, or we can help you with your research. If you do have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to send them directly to me or to SEI. But David, did you want to run through this lovely list of how you can further engage with SEI?
Yes, it's all right there. I mean, certainly the first thing is to sign up as a member. And as a part of that, we do want to know what folks, what their interests are, and get folks involved, not just as a general member of SEI, but as a potential researcher in any one of the research themes or projects that we've got going on. Definitely want people to keep on coming along to this new funding and pitching series. It really is a skill building exercise for ECRs and HDRs. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to help folks build their knowledge, their record, their careers. And I think there is a link in the chat to register for the next one. And then, you know, it's not just a one-way thing. If you've got some knowledge, if you know an agency or someone looking for research, come and talk to us. We can help build teams and help you develop projects. And as we said, we will be developing this sort of grants calendar. So we should have in the near future a more easily accessible set of resources for folks. But I just want to say thanks for coming. Let us know if you've got any ideas for workshops like this that you'd like some expertise to assist you. But in the meantime, thanks to Kirsten for organizing. Thanks to Evie for organizing. Thanks for everyone for coming along. I do hope it was helpful. Feel free to follow up with any of us with any remaining questions, and keep in touch, and hope to see you at the next one of these.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us.